my channel. So today I'm going to be talking about tips for working with paper clay. You may not have worked with paper clay before, and you may be a little bit intimidated to start some of my paper clay tutorials just since you've never worked with the medium before. So I'd like to give you some tips as you approach working with paper clay, and maybe to make your experience with paper clay a little bit better and easier. Come to your table working with paper clay with an open mind. Paper clay to me is a chance to return to your childhood Play-Doh days. Paper clay is a really easy clay to work with. It's not tough. It takes me out of my comfort zone and it allows me to loosen up. It allows me to not care about having so much control over this product because it's something that is really cool on its own. Use water on your fingers when you're moving the clay around. Paper clay is papier-mâché that's been turned into a clay form. It moves really easily when you keep water on it. If you're not keeping water on it, it is starting to dry. So it's also a great thing to keep a squirt bottle or to just drizzle some water over the clay that you're not working on currently. And again, when you're adding water, there's a really good happy medium that you need to find. Don't add too much water or else that clay really loses its integrity and it starts to kind of disintegrate. And that would be a way that it probably wouldn't attach very well if you had put too much water down on the original surface to begin with. That water will stay in there and it'll take a while for it to dry, and then it may not help that clay actually attach itself. Use wire, tape, cardboard, styrofoam, aluminum foil, etc. Use things to begin your structures. Basically, I do this with almost every project. I use something inside of the structure. Number one, it helps your structure to remain sturdy once it's finished. I've never had any of my paper clay projects break, and I think it helps that there's that inner structure. It gives it a little bit of strength that it may not have on its own and some integrity that it may not have on its own. It also gives you this jumping off point. You're not having to come up with an outline completely out of clay. You know, you're not just building up the clay, you have this thing to begin with. So when I was making the busts for the spectacles tutorial, I made that inner bust so I already had the outline of it and I wasn't having to build up a nicely shaped head and bust on its own. I was able to use that wire and tape as that jumping off point. Don't think you have to have sculpting tools. Don't think you need to invest in those. If that's what's preventing you from playing around with paper clay is a budget, I'd say get yourself some paper clay and then find some things around your home that could do similar things that sculpting tools do. Like I said, I use a paintbrush, and even if you don't have a paintbrush, maybe the edge of a pen. Try to find things laying around before you invest in sculpting tools. And then once you get into the medium, and if you decide that it's a medium that you'd really like to have stick around and you'd really like to learn more about and play with and even perfect, maybe that's when you would want to get some sculpting tools. But even then, I don't use a big set of them. I have really, my favorite one is the one that I use the most often with the really sharp side and then the rounded side. I haven't learned to use other sculpting tools, but those have been my favorite so far and have been appropriate for every project that I've attempted. These are things to remember as you work. Make sure as you work that your structure can stand on its own. If you have a project that you're wanting to be able to stand up, make sure that the bottom of it is flat enough at the start. Don't wait to make that even. Make it able to stand up at the beginning, and as you add clay, continue to make sure that your structure can stand up on its own, and then adjust accordingly. And if you have a hard time creating a sturdy base, you can use other materials. I've seen people use like antique little metal plates, or even like a wooden base. You know those like little wooden tree slices, kind of. That would be a cool thing to use, but you could use something sturdy in the first place to prop it up on. Also, make sure that you're checking your sculpture from every angle as you're working on it. Don't just come from one perspective, because whoever is going to view your sculpture isn't going to be looking at it from one perspective. So I'm inclined, as I'm doing my art, to just look from this one downward perspective, but I need to be flipping it over and seeing how all of it is working out, because it is a 3D object and it's going to be 3D after you've painted it and after you've finished it. And I would hate for one cheek to be this way and another to be this way because I only looked at it from one perspective. When you add clay to clay, you want to create a grip for your clay. A really great technique is cross-hatching. Like I said, it's just taking, a sharp tool and creating like a checkerboard with your lines, and then wetting it and then applying clay. It's just creating a grip for your clay so that your clay isn't trying to stick to something that's kind of slick. It has some texture that it can grab onto. And then when you start working it in and working out those seams and making the seams disappear into the other clay, that you can rest assured knowing that what you've added will not easily come off, or may not ever come off. Most likely will not ever come off. I'd say that's a surefire way to make sure that anything you add won't budge. However, if you have a sculpture that is completely dry and you're not satisfied with how it's gone, again, you can still add clay. I went back and I just started wetting the dry sculpture that I had and applying clay to it, and I started applying it in small layers. I didn't just attach huge things to it, or I didn't just attach a new tail or anything like that. I was building up the clay, and I'd say that's a good way to make sure that the clay that you're adding will stay on. You can sand paper clay. If you have some sandpaper and you're not happy with the texture on your paper clay sculpture, if there are some parts that are sticking up that you didn't intend to be there, you can sand it down. And keep your finished product away from water. And this is really necessary if you haven't put any kind of finish on it. If it's simply just the original structure, they are not water resistant. One way to protect it is to put a varnish on it, or to put some kind of finish. So if it happens to come in contact with water, it wouldn't ruin it as quickly as if you hadn't protected it in the first place. To me, this is pretty important because sculptures can get dusty, especially if they're sitting on a counter, and I'd feel better about dusting a sculpture that had a finish on it rather than knowing that I'm dusting where I had painted, where I just have a layer of paint and nothing over the paint. So I definitely suggest for you to find maybe like a Mod Podge. I don't know if that would work over a watercolor, if you painted it with watercolor. I've never tried Mod Podge on a sculpture before. I have a spray can of a varnish, and that works just fine for me because I'm not painting it on and I'm not moving around any paint that I've previously applied. I really love using watercolors on top of paper clay, and obviously watercolors move when they have water on them, so I don't know if a Mod Podge would work for what I use it for, but that spray varnish really does work for me. Experiment with multiple mediums when you're using paper clay. You've seen me use wire a lot in my previous tutorials. Find odds and ends. If you're a collector, if you have things sitting around, definitely reach for other mediums. This is a really cool medium to use with mixed media sculpture work, with wire, with paper, with anything like that, with pen, with glue. Even like I said before, with like metal bases and things like that. Just use your imagination. Make sure you're putting it in an airtight container. I normally put mine in a big Ziploc bag, and I make sure that all of the air is out of it, and it keeps for a very long time that way. You just really don't want your leftover clay to dry out. So you do not have to use the whole packet in one sitting. Just make sure that you're storing it appropriately. And maybe check it every now and then, get it out and kind of mold it in your hands and add some water to it just to make sure that it's still moist, and then it's still going to be usable when you reach for it again. So I hope these tips have helped you out, and they've been maybe a comfort, and maybe they've encouraged you to approach these Paperclay tutorials. Let me know if you have any other questions in the comments, and please like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to see more. And I'll talk to you guys later. Have an awesome day. Bye.